Joining us now is Joanne Cronrath Bamberger. Joanne Bamberger is an entrepreneurial journalist, aren't we all? An award-winning writer, an attorney, and a political media analyst whose latest book is Love Her Not, The Hillary Paradox, and we may get into that. But first, we'll be talking about the debate a little bit, the Democratic debate. Joanne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, I think you and I are two of the relatively small cohort of people, but still well into the millions, who saw the Democratic debate last
Yes.
Saturday. And whenever we talk about politics on this show, I always preface it by saying I do work for the Bernie Sanders campaign, so people are free to delete or edit my observations accordingly. But I was very interested in your take on this debate, since you've explored the topic of Hillary Clinton and her relationship to the public eye so much. So let's start with the broadest possible question. What did you think?
Well, I thought it was a good debate. I think generally, regardless of politics, the Democratic debates are better right now than the Republican debates, just because you have fewer people on stage. So they actually can discuss things if they so choose, rather than the Republicans where everyone's just trying to get their talking points out. But it did. I liked that they changed the what was supposed to be the main topic to foreign policy. I thought
Mhm.
that was appropriate after the events in Paris last week. I know you work for Bernie. I was a little disappointed with his opening statement, that he sort of said a sentence and then just went back into his regular opening statement, sort of ignoring that was, supposed to be the primary topic. So I was a little disappointed in that.
Okay, how'd you feel Hillary did?
I thought she did well. I mean, for me, is the person on the debate stage at this point for the Democrats who has the most background and experience, both in foreign policy and in terms of personal relationships, both with foreign leaders and with the people in the Senate who are going to be hopefully working with whoever the next president is on, continuing to build foreign policy. So I thought she came across quite well in that regard.
So if we talk about foreign policy, though, I think what you find is that there was a substantive discussion and a substantive difference between the two candidates. My sense was that Bernie Sanders' position was, and I don't speak, I'm not a spokesman for him. I
Right.
want to make that clear. But my sense of it was that Bernie Sanders spoke for emphasis on an international coalition to solve the ISIS problem, asking the states in the region to take a frontline position as opposed to the United States. I think that's a position he's reiterated since then. I think Hillary's position is more emphasizing military action, which has been counterproductive in the area, and a no-fly zone, which I don't fully understand, because ISIS, at least at this point, does not have an air force.
Well, the no-fly zone has pretty much been there for a while, though, correct? I mean, that's something that Obama has talked about, and I'm not sure how productive that has been, but especially following her speech to the Foreign Policy Council this week, it sure sounded to me like she was advocating a coalition through diplomacy, and I think that's where her strength is going to be.
So once again, she moves to Bernie's position. Okay.
Well, I certainly would not agree with that. I mean, I think everybody agrees. It's probably Martin O'Malley's position, too. It should be every Democrat's position, and I don't think we would want to describe it as just Bernie Sanders' position. That there is a lot to be said for making sure that whatever combination you come up with, that's your plan for, dealing with global issues, that diplomacy is involved, as opposed to all the Republicans who basically, and I don't think I'm even paraphrasing here, want to bomb them back to the seventh century.
Well,
So I think at the very least, if there are some differences among the Democrats, the real true difference is among who's the Democratic candidate going to be, and what is that person going to say versus what the Republicans are going to do.
By the way, the Republicans have all endorsed the same idea of a no-fly zone. I don't think Obama's used that phrase, but let's switch to economic policy. One of the big differences between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders is Bernie wants to break up the big banks and reinstitute Glass-Steagall. Hillary does not want to do those things, although to her credit, she does want to. She says she wants to increase regulation and encourage more prosecution of individual bankers. So,
Well, I think Bernie's position is really somewhat unrealistic, especially as someone who worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I don't think anyone is ever going to get anywhere by saying they're going to break up the big banks because that may sound good, but it's never going to happen. And I don't see how you could do it and keep the financial system in this country going. As for Glass-Steagall and financial and banking regulations, yes, I definitely think that we need those things back the way we had them before. And I think the issue with trying to give the SEC and the criminal authorities who prosecute Wall Street and white collar crime is that the Congress is constantly cutting the funding. So, there are certain things that we would look to in candidates in terms of what they want to say. I think ultimately we have to look to Congress and say, stop cutting the budget, especially for the Securities and Exchange Commission, because if you are, basically disarming the regulators, the candidates can talk all day about let's get this regulation back and that regulation back, but I don't see a Republican Congress doing that anytime soon.
Okay, so we agree on a couple things and disagree on a couple things. I think we agree on Glass-Steagall. I think it's perfectly feasible, having worked on Wall Street myself for a number of years. I think it's perfectly feasible to break up the big banks. I know you worked for the SEC, but I think that in addition to their very legitimate funding problems, we have had under Obama and before him, Bill Clinton, regulators who have shown a lack of zeal in pursuit of their own efforts. And as far as prosecution is concerned, the Justice Department certainly has a budget. It was not a budgetary constraint that prevented the Justice Department from pursuing banking cases. It was other factors, right?
I will say, regardless of who's at the top of the divisions in the SEC and how you might perceive any individual leader, I can speak from experience in telling you that the staff is always quite zealous in trying to bring those cases, and they're the people on the ground trying to investigate those things and, bring those things to light. And I think if we had more funding for the staff to be able to do those things, maybe the people who are at the top making the decisions might make different decisions.
Well, I would love to get that funding and find out. I do agree with you that a lot of cases, staff members are more zealous than their appointed leadership. I think that's definitely true. Now, this is a question on a lot of people's minds. Obviously, it was brought up in the debate. Can Hillary Clinton be trusted to go after Wall Street, given the amount of speaking fees and political contributions she's gotten from Wall Street over the years?
Can any candidate? Did
Sure,
people
Bernie
trust,
hasn't taken any money from them.
trust Barack Obama? He got plenty of money from Wall Street.
Right.
There are plenty of candidates who get money from Wall Street, and I think in a way, it's a bit of an unfair comparison because for the most part, with obviously Bernie Sanders being one of the exceptions, most people do get funding from Wall Street, and I think she did make a very good point that's perhaps not justifying, but explains when you have the whole Wall Street area that was so devastated by 9/11 that, and being a senator from New York State, there was a certain bit of pressure on her to be able to make sure that those entities kept running and that those people still had their jobs. I'm not trying to justify any sort of connections with big banks or anything, but I think it is wise to take a step back and say, who was she representing at the time? And look at the decisions she made based on that.
It's also worth noting that her large contributions from Wall Street began in 1999, well before, of course.
As with many candidates, I mean, I really think it's sort of a red herring to talk about whether people are, taking money from whatever entities. I mean, I think they're all worth investigating because when any candidate takes a large amount of money from any entity, that's worth exploring. But by the same token, I don't think you can trash a candidate without having explored the background. And so I think while some of these conversations are legitimate to have, I think it's a bit of a red herring to say, oh, but we've got Bernie Sanders over here who is clean as the driven snow, and then Hillary Clinton and all the other candidates who, oh my God, they are, just so corrupt we can't even talk about it.
Well, it's a matter of degree.
Plenty of middle
I
ground to
think,
talk about.
Joanne, I think it's a matter of degree. And I think the fact is she's taken enormous amounts of money, the six-figure speaking fees for 20-minute talks to Goldman Sachs or something. But look, we disagree. People will.
I bet Bernie would take that speaking money if he could get it.
Nope. Bernie got $1,218 last year in speaking fees, and he gave it to charity. But having said that,
so and then you're saying that capitalism is a bad thing in candidates, and that we should just look at the socialist candidates?
I would say capitalism is a good thing, but not in a politician. I think if you're a politician, you're a public servant. I don't think politics is a business to get wealthy in. No, I disagree.
Agree. I mean, I'm sort of kidding you here, but yeah, I agree. It isn't a business to get rich. But she was not making paid speeches while she was Secretary of State. She had time in between Secretary of State and running for president, and I think it's really not realistic to expect that all of our candidates are going to take socialist positions. And I think we have to take each candidate where they are and look at them and examine all of them and not just immediately say, oh, X candidate has done X, Y, and Z, and so therefore immediately they are taken out of the mix.
I think you're creating artificial binaries here where it's either you take enormous amounts of money from Wall Street and it's not fair to bring that up, or you're a socialist. I think that there are a lot of politicians, most Democratic politicians have not taken nearly as much money from Wall Street, either in personal speaking fees or in campaign contributions. So I think to a certain extent it's a matter of degree, and I think it's to a certain extent voters have got to decide their level of confidence in the candidate. But let's switch for a second. There's a question I'd really like to ask you, Joanne Bamberger. Your book is Love Her Not: The Hillary Paradox, and I agree in part with the premise of the book, which from what I've read so far, it's a very interesting book. She is a complex figure who I happen to share what I strongly believe are Bernie's personal feelings about her, which is a great deal of respect and appreciation for what she's accomplished, a lot of difference on policy and concerns about relationships. I guess that's the way I'd put it, but I have enormous regard for her abilities. But isn't it possible that in addition to the people who may have, baggage against her and so on, isn't it possible just to disagree with a candidate based on policy?
Yes, I would certainly hope that. I think that's how we should all look at candidates. Take a look at their policies, take a look at their positions, what they've done in the past, what they say they're going to do in the future. For me, we should all judge candidates in that way. Sadly, the research has shown that that's not what happens in the real world, and especially when it comes to women voters looking at women candidates. That several research studies have shown that women voters have to view women candidates as likable in order to see them as qualified, which makes me very sad. I mean, of course, we all, we have had the infamous everyone wants to have a beer with George Bush sort of thing. And there is a certain amount to what kind of charisma does a candidate bring. We obviously saw that with Barack Obama. But it was troubling to me, and it was something that I wanted to explore in the book, to try to get to the why behind that question and have women write about from various standpoints why they have those feelings about Hillary Clinton and how they impact whether they will ultimately vote for her or not.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Do the polls show, it's not a leading question, I honestly don't know the answer, do the polls show that women, a majority of women have this sort of prerequisite for voting for Hillary Clinton to a greater extent than they do, let's say, to male candidates?
Well, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, which I think they were one of the first ones to do this research, that they found that women voters did not seem to feel they needed that in deciding that a male candidate was qualified.
Hmm.
And I think we see that with the Republicans and seeing Donald Trump at the top of the field for the most part. And that was one of the things I wanted to explore, how women and women's relationships and how women view themselves come into play when they're considering any woman candidate, not just Hillary Clinton, but when they're looking at any candidate who's a female, why are they projecting that additional requirement on them? And the the Lee Family Foundation research said it was 90% of the women they polled indicated that they needed to feel that the woman candidate was likable.
Did that skew at all by generation? I guess at 90%, it would be hard for it to.
Right.
So that's the premise of your book in a nutshell.
Well,
That's
that
the.
was the start of it.
Mhm.
And I hoped that the essays could sort of put some meat on the bones of that research to explore why from a variety of standpoints. There are plenty of essays in the book that talk about her from a policy standpoint in terms of hoping that she focuses on the quote unquote parents agenda, but also looking at whether she comes from a place of privilege and how we feel about
Mhm.
that, and how we feel about a variety of things, how she's been treated in terms of whether she's experienced much more sexism than other candidates. And the interesting thing to me was, and someone put it this way a few days ago, they said, I'm the comma in the love her not. That they didn't feel like they totally loved her or they totally hated her. That really, for the most part, the essays come out somewhere in the middle, that they're very nuanced and say, I like certain things about her and not other things. And I would hope that we look at all candidates in that way.
Yes, I would hope so too. And it's a very fascinating premise for a book. So Joanne Bamberger, love her not, the Hillary paradox. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.